But now we can start the lecture. Our speaker today is Mohammed Bamyeh from Pittsburg, where it's still morning. We'll be talking about the no-state solution. So welcome.
Okay, thank you, Antti. I'm glad to be here with you to talk about this issue. The idea of a no-state solution has been an evolving idea that has been presented and discussed in various forums in the last year and a half, at least. And it emerges out of the current crisis, although in some form the idea is older than the current crisis. But there is something unusual about our times right now. We have never had in world history basically a genocide being done in broad daylight, right, in front of the entire world. Right? And we have never seen kind of the amount of complicity of and support, in fact, by the great powers of this catastrophe that is happening. And also, in some way, it is in kind of an intensification of the heritage of colonialism and the modern states that emerged out of the colonial experience. And Palestine is, in my view, basically one place in the world where kind of modern states basically and the way by which kind of the problem that they power that they exercise over population kind of demonstrates how it reaches its limits. The genocide that is happening in Palestine is because there is a state that is capable of doing it. It is a question of capacity and not just an ideology that justifies it. It is also part of the logic of settler colonialism, which produces a state that is much more intrusive than the modern state in general. So I'll talk about all these issues, and I'd like to talk with the empirical kind of focus on Palestine, but also kind of will try to make kind of more general arguments about the no-state solution everywhere in the region as a historical reality, basically, and not as some kind of utopian experiment. First, I'd like to talk about the ordinary state-based solutions and why they have never worked, and that's why they will never work. Second, I'd like to talk about the Palestinian society itself, namely the way by which it was capable of emerging as a society without a state, and the implications of that. Third, I'd like to discuss the no-state social realities throughout the region historically, right, and in the present as well. Right? And then I'd like to say a few words about the emergence of modern states and their failures at many levels, which is very evident today, especially in the revolutionary waves that have seen in the Middle East lately. And finally, I'd like to say something about realism as a perspective and reality, basically, and the question whether any of this that I'm talking about is realistic and how it should be viewed in that perspective. So first, let me say something about state-based solutions. As you know, or probably know, that for several decades already, it looked like we had only one solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that was a two-state solution. Until today, diplomatic circles continue to talk about this as the only viable and lasting solution. Now, that solution historically had all the ingredients of success, but it never happened. And by ingredients of success, I mean that it was broadly supported by the international community, regional powers also accepted it. Most Palestinian factions, including Hamas, also accepted it. Right? at various points, it has majority support in both Israeli and Palestinian societies. So here you had a solution that had all the ingredients of success behind it, yet we never managed to get there. And the question is why? Why such an obvious solution is so impossible to reach? And that really takes us, answering that question takes us to the core of the problem, right, of state-oriented thinking. There are three basic reasons why we never got the two-state solution. One of them is the balance of power that is completely lopsided in the sense that you have Israel as a modern, highly militarized state that enjoys the unlimited support of the major superpower in the world, right? That is relatively technologically advanced and rich, right? And that seems to be also solidly supported by most European powers, right? Regardless of what it does. And we see that in the current genocide. On the other hand, you have the Palestinians who are, more than half of them are diasporic populations. They tend to be resourceless. Half of them are, until today, continuing to be registered as refugees. Right? And they have many friends around the world, but none with enough power to actually change that equation. So a fundamental problem here is the lopsided balance of power, right? Namely, we have one party to this conflict, if we want to call it conflict, that has basically so much power that it has no incentive to give the absolute minimum that would be necessary to kind of satisfy the national aspirations of the weaker party, and the weaker party has no resources at all to be able to get the absolute minimum that would be able to live with. And that equation, when you have equations like that, then the only way out of the dead end that implicated in them is to introduce a third factor into the equation. And that third factor is where, for example, when the weaker power acquires more power, more resources, makes noise, uses armed struggle, integrate itself into the global liberation movements, uses boycott, for example, as a technique of resistance, and so on. All these techniques basically face repression in the West, and are often being banned, such as the boycott movement, for example, in many European countries. So the equation remains with us until today, and we see that in the sense that the two-state solution rather is talked about only when there is a crisis, like now, for example. And then once the crisis is over, it was dropped. No one talks about it anymore. We have seen that before. So the two-state solution is often offered as a mirage. Diplomatic sources that talk about it know the reality that it will never happen, but use it as some way to diffuse the current crisis somehow, to tame the tension until we get back to the earlier situation in which the Palestinians could be forgotten about and the world order moves on. That has happened before, right? And that is where we are right now. The second kind of fundamental reason for why the two-state solution never happened is because simply the Palestinians are not a priority for any government in the world, including Arab governments. They seem to be states, basically as states, and I'll get back to that point later, usually for kind of their interests vis-a-vis kind of struggles and alliances with other states. And in that equation, stateless people generally do not really have a role other than occasionally as a weapon basically, in a fight against other states. But once that fight is resolved somehow, the stateless people could be forgotten again. And so the Palestinians have never been a priority, right, for any power, basically, in the world, and continue not to be a priority for any kind of governing power. There may be a priority for solidarity movements, for example, but not really for governing orders, that once they are governing, then they have to play in the international arena of politics vis-a-vis other states. The third reason why we don't get to the two-state solution is simply settler colonial ideology, which is, of course, the foundational ideology of Israel. And that idea from the beginning, as in all kind of settler colonial experiments, kind of the native population, the indigenous population, if you will, is regarded simply as kind of besides the point. That they are there, but they're standing in the way of extracting resources and land and so on. And there are many historical examples. I can give an entire lecture on the history of Zionism and Zionist thought and its kind of dismissive relationship to the Palestinians in general. And that includes the most liberal varieties of Zionism. That includes, for example, the kibbutz as an institution, which is often in the West imagined basically as a utopian socialist experiment, but it is forgotten that the kibbutz, even that institution, was established as a racial experiment. In the first kibbutz in 1908 in Palestine was explicitly kind of founded in order to kind of keep Palestinian farm labor outside of Jewish lands, so that cohesive Jewish community in Palestine could emerge that is completely distinct from the indigenous Palestinian population. That was the project of Zionism from the beginning and continues to be at the core of the Zionist project until today, with all its variety. And we see it today basically in the genocide and the ethnic cleansing that has been happening already in Palestine. We had lots of massacres before, but not full-scale genocide until now. But we did have ethnic cleansing several times, basically, in Palestinian history. And all that flows out of this exclusive kind of racial settler colonial policy that is based on treating the native as inferior or as basically not deserving of the kinds of resources on which they sit. If there's time, I'll get back to that point with more examples later on. But let me move on to the second major point in this no-state argument, which has to do with Palestinian society itself. Namely, after the dispossession of the Palestinians in 1948, for a long time, the Palestinians were forgotten. Ultimately, they lived 3/4 of the population of Palestine was ethnically cleansed in 1948, and most of them became refugees. And they had no real organizations to begin with. Obviously, they had no state. Ultimately, so the question and the expectation was that Palestinian society or Palestinians would disappear over time, namely, like other native populations in diaspora. Basically, they would melt away. That was, in fact, expressly kind of mentioned by John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State of the U.S. in the 50s, who expected that within one generation, the Palestinians would cease to exist, basically as a people. Now, that did not happen. In fact, Palestinian society maintained itself in diaspora, in refugee conditions, and basically without a state. And how was that accomplished? So first of all, we have three processes that kind of came together. All of them are sociological processes that kind of created a sense of Palestinianness after the Nakba. One of them one of those kind of resources was simply a traditional village culture, the traditional Palestinian culture, but specifically village culture. Many, of course, of the refugees came out of villages and were peasants. That, by the way, was the case in Gaza in particular. For example, Gaza, 3/4 of the population of Gaza are actually refugees from 1948 already, and most of them were villagers, were farmers, ultimately were peasants. And in the refugee camps, they brought their culture with them. Why? Because they needed to. The refugee camps were meant to be temporary settlements. That means that state law did not apply to them, that there is no property rights, for example. But if you live in it for decades in the refugee camp, and your children are born there, and then their children are born also in the refugee the refugee camp becomes a city. It becomes actually something else other than what it was intended to be. All that basically without any legal guarantees as any of this is being is lasting. So what you have basically in the life in the refugee camps became organized according to the familiar patterns of Palestinian village, namely a great deal of mutual help, a great deal of solidarity, a great deal of hospitality, a great deal of self-reliance, and so on. So the village culture migrated, right? Especially the anarchist, the kind of self-governing kind of dimensions of village culture, traveled or moved into diaspora with the Palestinians into the refugee camps and organized life there according to familiar patterns of social organizations, which have many anarchist features. And I can talk about those more if there's time. Now, by the late 60s, there's another culture that enters the refugee camps, which is a modern revolutionary culture. And you see that in the emergence of the Palestinian movement, various factions of it, all of which were organized as political parties that came with militia, that came with meritocratic kind of criteria for leadership, that traditional criteria for leadership. So you gain prominence within the organization on the basis of your qualification rather than genealogy. And that movement also operated across all refugee camps, as well everywhere Palestinians lived. And these two cultures, namely the traditional culture and the revolutionary culture, lived side by side in the same places, in the same refugee camps, in the same locations wherever Palestinians lived. They do not cancel each other out, to speak, right? And so they gave together a deeper sense of being a Palestinian in today's world, in particular, in conditions of oppression. In addition, you have a third process that was happening globally, which is the building of a global Palestinian civil society, in the various associations, charitable organizations, student groups, workers, trade unions, women's organizations, and so on. And that civil society organized itself after the model of global clubs, basically, and all of those became members of the PLO eventually. So these three forces have reproduced Palestinian society in conditions of diaspora, and they showcase the agency of society without a state. That all that was done without a state, without the help of any state. And see, you have here already the genesis of the anarchist capacity of self-organization that in the absence of a state. this case. And that process is not as visible, basically, in our discussions very much because we focus too much on today's conflicts without kind of enough of a sociological interest in how Palestinian society continue to survive as a society and feel itself as a society in spite of all the hardships that it had faced. So we know how to live without a state already. And that takes me to the third point, which is that this is not necessarily a special kind of Palestinian accomplishment, but other people in the region also have historically and today know how to live without a state. And it is not just the Palestinians. So what is that historical reality that I'm talking about? Let me just focus on the Middle East for now, or at least the region that we call the Middle East, just to stay with the empirical material that we have. Prior to the colonial era, there were states, of course, in the Middle East. There were always states there, but the pre-colonial state did not really mean the same thing that the colonial and post-colonial state actually mean. The pre-colonial conditions meant that borders were not important. That is, even if you had states, you could cross so-called borders with ease. No one stopped you anywhere. What we today call migration, which is a term that I no longer use actually, because I prefer to talk about population movements, basically as something that is natural historically, that as a historical way by which humanity adapted to demographic and ecological problems, and as opposed to allow those problems to be concentrated in one location until they explode in that location. Historically, free movement was the norm in the Middle East. Free movement across what today would look like borders. And that was for many reasons. Just for first of all, the basic demography that kind of mandated that, but also pilgrimage routes, the trade routes. Most wealth, basically in the Middle East, came out of long-distance trade historically, and for many centuries that was the case. Free movement also meant free associations and multiple loyalty. So if you look at the pre-colonial and well into the 20th century, Middle Eastern cities, most of them were multi-ethnic, multi-religious, very mixed. You have large Jewish populations, for example, in Baghdad, throughout North Africa, in Alexandria, in Yemen, in Morocco, in Persia, Turkey. Everywhere you looked, you had actually large Jewish population mixed in with Muslim, Christian, etc., all those other populations, as well as Italian and Greek populations, as well as Central Asian populations that also lived in those cities as well. So those pre-colonial cities in the Middle East were connected with each other and sustained this multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multiple loyalties kind of fabric without tension, for the most part peacefully, actually, for centuries. And the Jews who lived in those cities never felt compelled to go to their promised land, even though it was nearby and even though nothing stood in their way to go there. Right? So that historical reality was destroyed basically in the modern states. The modern states were established with more kind of heavily policed borders, restrictions of movement, insistence on sovereignty, the principle of exclusive and strong kind of sovereignty by each state vis-a-vis other states. And those states kind of began to think of themselves and each other as competitors, right, rather than as a kind of simply superstructures on top of society. Also, one more thing about the pre-colonial states that is important to mention is that they were not really visible to most populations. So, for example, you had an Ottoman Empire and other empires before it as well, but at the level of everyday life, no one actually saw the empire. It was a distant structure far away from them, and that empire itself was happy to leave people alone, partially because the cost of control was just too much and was not worth it. And as long as you did two things, you were left alone. And these two things were taxes had to be paid, and you were not expected to rebel. And if you did these two things, you were left alone to govern yourself according to your own local customs and local traditions. And that also went well with this kind of ethnic, multi-religious, multiple loyalties, the kind of framework that I had just talked about. Namely that, okay, you have local life. Much of the elements of the local life also involve anarchist features as well that we can talk about if there's time as well, including how law, for example, operated at the local level in a way that most people understood, as opposed to being imposed by kind of a distant legal rational order, as will come later. So the historical principle, basically, right, continued to live. In fact, the historical memory, at least, and not don't talk about memory in the sense of what people have in their head, but memory as something that is actually rooted in practices that people do at everyday level, that becomes habitual, and that people call their traditions. And that you see kind of in the 20th century, the late 20th century in particular, where the increasing state failure allow people to rely again on themselves and on each other. And I'll move to that point a little bit. Now, let me just move to the point about the modern states, including settler colonialism, basically, and which is what leads us to where we are today, ultimately. Now, the record of modern states can be judged in terms of what we see today. Namely, we have a genocide in Gaza, ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. Both are continuations of practices that had happened earlier. But at the same time, we have had in the last 2 years, in particular, major wars in Yemen, Syria, Libya, lots of contestations in Iraq as well, civil war in Sudan. So here you have multiple large-scale wars within one region, which makes you think there's something that is deeply dysfunctional about the region as it is actually constructed today. And Israel-Palestine is really one extreme kind of symptom of that larger crisis that we're talking about. And those wars, including civil wars, of course, are also global wars. So if you think about Syria or Lebanon, the civil war in Lebanon previously, or Libya, or Yemen, all those so-called civil wars are or were basically global wars because each kind of party to those so-called civil wars is supported by some kind of large power outside of the country. So the war in Syria, for example, or in Yemen, is or was parties that were involved in, including the United States, Russia, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Qatar, etc. So those are really world wars, ultimately, that we're talking about. But they're called civil wars because they are concentrated in one territory. And that is really part of the problem that we have. Namely, the struggle to take over the modern state, basically, is a global issue. Right? It is also, of course, an issue for local forces, but so many other kind of states in the world are also interested in those various territories and fight over them because they're a source of power that comes out of controlling those states. And that comes with a way that has to do something with reason, with how those kind of states are designed. These states are not regionally integrated. They were set up in the colonial era as competitors with each other. They continue to operate as competitors with each other. And the logic of competition follows a zero-sum game, just like in Europe before World War I and World War II, where also European states acted that way, basically as competitors, basically, right? And they continue to work to act that way until they destroyed the entire continent twice, basically within 3 decades of the 20th century. And out of that destruction, there emerged something that we today call the European Union as a way to prevent World War III. But also with that come certain principles that are actually similar to the historical pattern of the Middle East, namely diluted sovereignties, free movement, and so on. Right? And that is not an anarchist system here, but at least it is an adjustment to the failure of individual states actually to either prevent destructive conflict on a repeated through repeated cycles or basically open themselves up as a kind of pawns for the struggle that also produces other kinds of conflicts. That diluted sovereignty and sense of relative borderlessness was in fact analogous to the Muslim and Middle Eastern realities before the colonial era. And that is what European kind of power basically tried to actually construct for themselves after World War II. And again, this is a long argument that we can kind of discuss if there is time. I just want to touch out here because I want to actually point out to the historical kind of problems that the existence of modern states in general in the Middle East kind of has produced. By modern, I mean states that actually understand themselves to have a kind of strong sense of sovereignty, that have a sense of impenetrable or fully controllable borders, that see themselves to be to require policing their population, knowing their population, and sometimes kind of treating that population as a threat to be kind of maintained, which all states basically in the Middle East now kind of that's their perspective of them. The modern state in the region, but also globally. This is an argument that I pursue in my book, Anarchy as Order, at length. State foundation, and we talk about the modern state rather than the pre-modern state, because of its intrusive kind of claim upon society, because of its kind of extensive domains of power, is typically tend to hit some local resistance, and that is the story that you see everywhere at the beginning, kind of stages of state formation. So each state is, if we stick with the Middle East, for example, but many parts of Europe also kind of argument applied as well, Latin America and so on. The state, right, is set up, the Mars state is as basically the enemy of a substantial part of the population in its territory. And against the will, right, of a major part of the population or most of that population. Right? Israel is a clear example of that. Right? So you have basically a state that in order for it to be established, you needed massacres, you needed wars, and you needed ethnic cleansing. Right? It was not a fairy tale, right? But that is really part of the larger kind of history, and namely the state, one state, it's established and requires violence. That requires basically excluding a substantial part of the population under its control, or repressing basically that population. And that already sets up the Mars state basically as the enemy of society, or the enemy of a substantial kind of portion of the society under its control. And out of that, we end up with either dictatorships as a way of policing the kind of opposition, or ethnic cleansing. And we had all that basically in the region. Now, the European story is similar, by the way. The historical sociologist Charles Tilly, who really spent a long time documenting the rise of European states, has argued that the machinations that are involved in building European states, modern European states that is, are really analogous to organized crime. That really states are founded by criminal gangs, more or less, right? Who are violent, right? Who basically have their own interests, who use the language of nationalism sometimes to serve their purpose. They may actually believe in it, but they operate in a way that the ends justify the means. To arrive basically at your desired kind of ideological objective, which is a Maya state, you need to kind of oppress somebody. You need to kill somebody. You need violence, basically. Or sometimes you need a way to you hang out with your own kind of a clique that believes in the same kind of a project, and you operate in the manner of a criminal gang, so to speak, at a highway robbery, until you take over the state, and basically resource extraction basically is regulated as taxes, as tributes, or as something that is legal in nature, even though it is not really very different from what organized crime had done before at the state. And those founders, over time, become celebrated as founding fathers of the nation, heroes, and so on. The founders of Israel had no compunction about ethnic cleansing. They were open about it, ultimately. That includes Yitzhak Rabin, who won the Nobel Prize, for example, but actually who directly basically committed ethnic cleansing at two major Palestinian cities, Lod and Ramla, basically were forcibly kind of evacuated and the population kind of expelled by Rabin. Yitzhak Rabin, the one who won the Nobel Peace Prize. So that is, so criminality basically at the most basic level was foundational to state formation, ultimately. And that meant that from the beginning we are going to have a kind of opposition that is lasting in the sense, in a way that primary states did not really need to kind of worry too much about. Now, the fact that the state is founded that way, ultimately, and the fact that it is the enemy of the people, or at least a large kind of percentage of the people, does not mean that it is rejected across generations. Right? So even orders that came out of criminal processes eventually may become tolerated by the population, eventually they may become accepted as well. But that depends on how they behave, right? That depends on how they develop beyond that original point, right? And that is when basically they begin to appear as forces of, say, emancipation, sources of welfare, sources of justice, all that. And that happens. So in a way, you begin to see basically states that become more and more accepted by populations that they have victimized, right, are the ones who actually go that route, which we typically call liberal, which is, I think, is reaching its end in our times. And that route essentially entails expanding kind of the right of citizenship, expanding kind of democratic realm of democratic participation, basically doing something that we call social justice, right? And sometimes you do that after revolutions that demand that. Right? So, for example, if you look at the Arab uprisings in 2011 and 2019 across the entire Arab world, those were the demands. The demands were, we need a different state than the one we have right now. We want a state that actually respects its people, that actually thinks of what we call the people as the source of legitimacy. Right? We want social justice. All those demands, right? Basically, that were kind of central to the liberal project that wanted to humanize the state, were really at the core of those modern uprisings. Right? And they were kind of signs of the failure of the state, right? Continuing failure of the state in the Arab world in particular, to live up to the post-colonial promises, where indeed basically you had actually that claim by the early post-colonial state. And that you begin to see in the 50s in particular, where a kind of a new species, a new kind of group who in Egypt, they call themselves the free officers. But you see really something like the free officers elsewhere in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Libya, and so on afterwards. Those were typically young officers in the army who received modern education, who typically came from poor or marginal social backgrounds, who had nothing to do with the old aristocracies in those countries, and who began to take over the state in the 50s and afterwards. I have ultimately, if I may, I just have a couple more words about the kind of the post-colonial condition, and then move on to realism. Just for a couple of 5 minutes, if I may. One of them is that the free officers era that I'm talking about, basically where the free officers basically make, in fact, seem to be trustworthy custodians of the modernist project of democratization, sovereignty, freedom, national liberation, and so on. And that made the states over which they presided a lot more popular than they were before for a while, until, of course, they failed essentially by the neoliberal era. The kind of promises that they had made. The system that they had built, which had a revolutionary foundation at the beginning, ended up being broadly seen as corrupt kind of systems that does nothing to the people. And the 90s and afterwards, that failure of the state you're going to see with how the revival of kind of ordinary, traditional kind of patterns of self-reliance, where a large number of people in various countries, and not just in Palestine, rely on themselves in order to build shanty towns illegally and without even infrastructure. And that establishes new kind of realities. Before 2011, before the revolution, large millions of people in that entire region basically also began to live outside the states, ultimately, and rely on each other for their foundations. So here, when we move into the area, we realize that most people in the region, right, live outside the state, beyond the state, or think of the state basically as an enemy or as an obstacle to go around, rather than as a helpful factor. and that is a more general kind of situation. And Israel, I think, is the more kind of extreme kind of manifestation of that reality. Now, there are a few words I can say about how the society of Gaza in particular, kind of before, of course, this current war has adjusted to something that's much more profound than state failure, that is state hostility and genocidal intention. And there you have more extreme kind of form of social adjustments to that kind of reality. That again is a long discussion, but I can talk about it if there's time later on. In the interest of time, let me just say a few words about reality. That is, I spoke at the beginning of about the so-called realist solutions and why they fail. And now I want to say a couple of words about realism as it applies to the no-state kind of argument. And I think of the no-state argument basically not as the only possible solution, but I think of it as the optimal kind of solution, given the analysis I just provided about the historical and contemporary realities. And the idea is that each solution we can think of has advantages and disadvantages. Right? So they're not necessarily exclusive of each other. Right? So a two-state solution, if it ever happens, I don't think it's going to happen, but if it ever happens, would be better than the occupation of it. A one-state solution, combining all people, right, Jews and non-Jews, right, and Palestinians, basically, with equal rights, would be preferable to the two-state solution. And the no-state solution is preferable to the one-state solution. Right? So these solutions, basically, one has to think of it as not as in terms as orders of preference, basically in terms of the realities that we have. Now, reality. The 2 points about reality very quickly. Right? One of them is that realism as a way of thinking, right, is useless. Right? When you face a situation like that we're facing today, right? That is, you have the structures that has given you genocide, right? That are barbarians, basically, in terms of the relationship to population, cannot be counted upon, basically, as a realistic kind of sources of justice. Right? Realism has always meant living with the status quo, right? And thinking about parameters of problem solution within the realm of the status quo. Right? That does not work, right? Obviously, right? Given the current reality that we have. Right? So realism means the perpetuation of injustice. And that is why revolutions everywhere, right, were carried out by unrealistic people. And they have changed the world. Right? If you think about Khomeini, Castro, Simon Bolivar, right? The Palestinians themselves, Zionism even, right? All those were unrealistic movements at the beginning, right? All of them were basically work of dreamers, people who did not just did not simply reject reality, but also were unrealistic, basically, in terms of what they do. And the lack of realism, the sense that I cannot live with this reality, and the realism, basically, that is introduced as a way of negotiation. If that is insufficient, then I have to think beyond reality and have to rely on my will and organizing capacity. People have changed the world were always unrealistic people, and they were driven by complete revulsion, basically, at the status, at the conditions in which they live. That applies to the Palestinians as well. Now, so that is where basically the argument basically has to begin for the no-state solution, namely that realism, not just reality, is genocidal and horrible, but realism, basically, as a perspective, has produced that condition itself, and therefore we need kind of a way to go about it. And that is demonstrated by our history, that the continuous search for ways that go beyond existing realistic perspective to solve problems. The other kind of a problem with realism as a perspective is social science itself. So I mean sociology, political science, economics, the kinds of things that I practice, frankly, and my colleagues do practice. And the problem, and I have no problem with knowledge that is produced basically in those social sciences in general, but the problem is what we understand as understanding, namely that in social science today, the emphasis is on understanding the objective conditions, how objective conditions give us a reality that we have, right? Or why is the reality that we have is what it is and not something else, right? And the answer to that question basically goes typically to identifying the structures, that is the necessary conditions that has produced the reality that we have right now. And that is called understanding, but ultimately it is immobilizing, because understanding here means that you have discovered that the reality that we have is necessary. Not necessary and ethically necessary, but structurally necessary. It's produced by forces that, because they are structures and solid, they cannot be changed. And so basically the analysis that takes you in the direction of the no-state solution basically goes beyond I think what modern social science basically in general basically is attempted or is training us to do. And let me stop here and look forward to hearing what you think of any of this.
Yeah, let's have questions, but I think, yeah, maybe we can even put a bit light, because it's completely dark. But yeah, it's let's have a questions, but the microphone is here, so you should maybe come a bit more closer, or we can try if it's possible. But yeah, maybe to come a bit more closer, but don't need to come, because my camera is only this one, but you can come a bit more closer to this side. So who has comments? I have many, but we can have some others.
Ask a shy question.
Yeah, just yeah.
Hello, thank you very much for the lecture. I wonder, I hope I didn't miss it in the beginning, but who is discussing the non-state solution at the moment? What kinds of circles is it being discussed in? It would be great to hear more about that, where it's come up so far.
It began actually in the latest iteration of it began in 2024, early 2024. First in a conversation in Victoria, in Canada, basically. That was very well attended, in fact, online as well as in person, between me and Uri Gordon, who was an anarchist, Israeli political scientist, and then there were several kind of other events, especially that were held around that in Germany, in particular, in the United States as well, and online, at various formats. The circles have been traditionally anarchist circles in all those countries, but also the argument has presented to more general publics, especially in Germany, in Berlin and Göttingen and so on. And there is a summary of the argument that's available online on various sites, the same text. And recently I just finished a long article that tries to respond to all the problems that have been raised. It's not yet published. I just finished it a couple of days ago. So the argument is known in anarchist circles largely, but it also goes beyond. Right now, there are other audiences that have been introduced to it, namely in the Sociology of Islam, for example, which is a global network, as well as among activists in the Arab world and in the Middle East in general. And so the non-anarchists, basically, that also are becoming familiar kind of with the idea.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, then I would ask the next question was about, there was some criticism of the title of this event, this non-state solution to Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and there was criticism that there is no any conflict, that there is a genocide. What would you think about this?
Well, I don't think we need to get lost in semantics about this, because conflict is sort of like a neutral term that we have. There is a conflict and there is genocide. And the genocide is basically one kind of symptom of an intensification of the conflict. The conflict, we're talking about 100 years, basically a conflict, so to speak, taking various levels of intensity ultimately. But at the root of it was kind of a colonial logic, and in this case, a settler colonial logic. Settler colonialism is a conflict with an indigenous population, but it is not a typical conflict in the sense like a class conflict, for example, right? But rather it is basically about displacing the indigenous population and taking resources away from them, and if needed, exterminating them or expelling them. Right? So it is a conflict of a different order, basically, when you have kind of settler colonialism is there. I think today, you're right, today we are actually talking about genocide, pure and simple, and we know that there is a resistance to using that term. I published 2024 an essay in German newsletter about the war in Gaza, and I used the word genocide, and the editor said, we agree with you, but we cannot use the word genocide. Can you think of a different term? So I said, okay, mass killing, what do you think? He said, okay, mass killing is good. So they published it with that kind of formulation. But the fact that there's a resistance in some circles to call what is happening genocide shows that we are actually saying something that is important, right? Not important enough to be resisted. Right? Most people in the world know that this is genocide. It's actually not something that I think needs to be argued anymore. Right? The 85% of scholars of genocide now call it genocide. Okay. So it is abundantly clear, right? Ultimately, and I have no problem actually using the term as well. It's a conflict that is based on settler colonial logic that has turned into genocide, which is how often settler colonial kind of system kind of end up when they hit the wall and they can't actually go beyond that.
Yeah, and also, yeah, I forgot to mention that we usually we are now making recording in the stream, but at some point I can switch it off, so it's possible to ask also off the record the questions, whoever wants. But anyway, is there any more questions on the record?
Hi again. I'm asking another question since I have the opportunity. There's been this situation unfolding in Finland recently where the state is not recognizing a Palestinian passport for refugees so that they could be able to stay here and they could make a case for themselves. And I wonder what would that mean in terms of this kind of state bureaucracy if we were going into this kind of direction and then other countries or states, they expect these kinds of state structures and formalities to be in place if there was to be something that escalates again, and then we need to protect all the people of the world. So just kind of curious about this. I think the argument is really interesting and I'm kind of keen to develop it, but just there's been this really practical problem recently. So just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is actually an important point. I don't know all the local kind of policies, but I know actually Palestinians are being actually harassed in so many countries and are increasingly being seen as a threat because they are regarded to be problematic people with grievances who could actually do something that is spectacular and we don't want. So again, we are a security threat to established orders, or are perceived as such, ultimately. Now, that also what you are describing is part of a larger pattern that has to do with many governments see this war as an opportunity to finish off the Palestinian cause. That includes important countries like Germany, for example. Germany, right, and I'm talking about the government, right, fully supports the genocide against the Palestinians with weapons, right, not just with diplomacy, and stands in the way of any kind of sanctions against Israel. Right? So does the United Kingdom, by the way. So does France, ultimately, in spite of the fact that they make all this noise about the humanitarianism, but ultimately they have not stopped arms delivery to Israel throughout this war until today. And they have never stopped supporting a kind of Israel diplomatically until today. They have not stopped making arguments in the International Court of Justice against Israel. Or for in behalf of Israel, rather. So U.S., France, Britain, Germany, important countries, all support the genocide completely. And other lesser countries as well. And largely because, even though they don't actually say it that way, obviously, but their practices speak for themselves. Now, because that would be a scandal, the one way out of it that is purely symbolic is that many countries are threatening to recognize Palestine, basically as a state, which is not a bad thing, actually, but it's really distraction. Because when you recognize Palestine right now, it looks like you are doing something. But in fact, you're not doing anything. You're doing a symbolic step that saves you from having to do an real action basically to stop the genocide. So in a way, I think that countries or the governments in particular that are making that threat are trying to actually appear to be doing something because there is a pressure on them to do something, when in fact all they are doing is something symbolic that saves them from having to do something. Restrictions on Palestinians, forbidding speech, and I know that because I live part of the year in Germany, every year, and I'm very familiar basically with censorship and repression and police violence basically against Palestinians. As out of fear that Palestinians actually will become, precisely because they are being oppressed, precisely because they are being killed, are becoming angry people, and because they're angry, they're going to become a security threat for us. That's the thinking that we have, right? But there's no opposition on the part of the most powerful governments in Europe, there's no opposition to the genocide. There's in fact an active kind of support for it, because without the government saying that, often they see it as a way to end the Palestinian problem, so to speak, once and for all. So, I don't know if that's actually so the one more thing actually about that I just want to say, and I was really careful to say governments and not countries, because in many countries there is a great disjunction between popular opinion and government policy. In Germany, for example, right now, according 80% of Germans, according to public opinion polls, oppose the German policy in vis-a-vis Israel right now, but 100% of the political class supports Israel. So there's a great disjunction between popular opinion there and government, kind of, or the idea of the political class. And that actually takes us to a larger problem about the crisis of modern democracy, namely how things like populism, things like unhappiness with democracy in general, I think comes out of this increasing gulf between kind of the outcome of democracy, which is the government, democratically elected government, and actually popular sentiment from day to day. And that disjunction is becoming more popular, evident vis-a-vis many issues, but in the case of Israel-Palestine, the difference is greatest, and that basically is part of the larger problem of really the democratic order as we have it right now, which really means a kind of a lack of voice of the population in politics between one election cycle and the next.
So, any more? Yeah, I have one more question, or actually maybe a couple of, I will ask it in two parts. But first is like, is kind of practical difference between one state solution and no state solution?
The one-state solution, people say, is more realistic than the two-state solution, just because these societies are intertangled because of the settlement policies, because of the question of control of resources in a small territory, and the one state would be, everyone would be equal citizenship to all. So in a way, it would be more realistic, in fact, than the two-state solution. But one problem with the one-state solution, ultimately, is that, like all modern states, it is going to encourage struggle of power to take it over. And we have struggle over power because we have power. And the stronger that power is, the more intense the struggle to take it over is. So you have one state, and you have two nations within it, so to speak, right? And you have a great deal of room for opportunistic politics, ultimately, to arise, that kind of inflame a kind of communal tension in order to gain kind of political benefit. And we see that often in societies where the state is perceived as something that needs to be captured because it has so many resources at its disposal, and needs to be captured at any cost, right? Including the cost of causing a civil war. The no-state solution has the advantage that it solves that problem. You have no struggle of power because you have no power, and you have, and there are degrees basically of levels of state as to get that point. If we want to actually be more technical about it, in the sense that a less centralized state, for example, may be less dangerous than unified centralized states, and so on. And we can go through that level of decreasing statelessness, statehood over society until we get to the no-state solution. So I'm not talking about a solution that you can get to from one day to the next. Actually, but rather as a gradual adjustment to the level, to the problem of statehood.
Yeah, I have continuation questions for this, because now we have, there are quite many movements that are supporting the both two-state solution and one-state solution. Like two-state solution is pushed by some liberals and leftists in the Israeli society, and also Fatah, many liberals in the United States and also North America and Europe. And it's also the short-term solution by Hamas. So all those people who are connected, there is a movement for this. But also the international movement is heavily supporting the one-state solution. It's the solution by BDS and also by PFLP long-term solution, and also by Hamas long-term solution, are mostly advocated by this movement. So do we really need a third movement which is supporting the non-state solution, or should we unite with these other movements that are currently much more bigger?
Yeah, no, I think actually we need a movement for the no-state solution by itself as a solution, and the time is now for that kind of movement. And I don't think these movements cancel each other out. Really, that's I speak of them in terms of orders of preferences. Ultimately, if we keep that perspective in mind, that is good. But the solution, I think, any solution begins with the idea of it being a solution, and not necessarily with reality. Ultimately, and that's why I talked about reality at the beginning, namely. Historically, kind of new ideologies, say socialism or anarchism or liberalism or what have you, begin as ideas, as propositions, not as something that is based on reality, but an idea that is based on the observation that nothing else is really working. So the no-state solution begins that way as well, like all other kind of conceptions of political life, as an idea, as a proposition, basically. And the more people are persuaded by it, the more realistic it becomes. So it is the realism here that comes out of persuasion, of convictions, of reiterating the argument, of people being convinced by it, people developing it further in practical terms, and so on. And the one-state solution, likewise, it actually is an idea. The two-state solution is also an idea that seemed to be most realistic, actually, precisely because everyone is for it, except for Israel. And in fact, and that is why it will never happen. There's no, in spite of the broad international kind of endorsement of the two-state solution, no Israeli government has ever actually agreed to a two-state solution, ever. Not even the most liberal kind of Israeli governments have accepted the two-state solution. And right now it is explicitly rejected by the current Israeli government, right? With the support of the vast majority of Israelis who actually no longer support the two-state solution anyway. So the two-state solution, which appears to be so realistic, is completely unrealistic right now. So we begin all movements, as usual, with the idea, right? And hopefully that the idea over time kind of establishes itself. Zionism started that way, by the way, as an idea, as a proposition, basically. And it took basically several decades until it actually shows itself to be something that is capable of being implemented.
Okay, any more questions? I can also switch off the recording so that we can have a bit more informal No. Okay, I guess. Okay, thank you for people who followed us in the stream. If you missed the beginning, I will publish it in 1 or 2 weeks in YouTube.